the truth is, these people, they have an incredible amount of skin in the game to not believe and not say the problem is inequality.
Hello and welcome to Equals, the podcast about inequality. I'm Grazielli.
And I'm Max, and it's the first episode of 2026. So, grazie, any New Year's resolutions for 2026?
Well, actually, I do. I'm really willing to go back to my kickboxing classes.
Kickboxing? Wow. I mean, you're taking the fight against inequality quite literally in 2026.
Yeah, well, I don't know if kickboxing will do it, but for sure, what we have this week is really good to fight inequality, which is the new Davos report from Oxfam. Please, Max, tell us about the amazing facts that the report always has.
Yeah, it's a really good one this year. It's called Resisting the Rule of the Rich. And the first thing that we highlight with the report is, whilst ordinary people worldwide are really struggling, we've got 1 in 4 people with not enough food to eat, having to skip meals. That includes millions of people in Europe and in the USA who are going hungry. Billionaires at the same time have seen their wealth increase 3 times faster in the last year to a record high. We've never had the number of billionaires we have now, over 3,000. And they're worth well over $18 trillion, which is a huge amount of money. But the main theme of the report this year, beyond highlighting the growth in economic inequality, is the link between that and politics and power. So it's one thing to, use your money to buy a bigger house or, a private jet. It's another thing altogether to use that money to buy a newspaper or buy a politician or buy a judge. And this relationship between the super rich and the politically powerful, and at the other end, the economically poor having their voices silenced, being repressed, being thrown in prison, the scapegoating of migrants, of minority groups. That's the topic of this year's report and what we could do to fight back against this political inequality as well as economic inequality. So it's a great read. I'd really recommend it.
Yes, such a great read and a subject for our fight against inequality. And that's why today we are going to talk with Gary Stevenson, who is one of the best communicators on economic inequality. He is a former trader in Citibank and he made millions. And he is also passionate about exposing how inequality undermines economic and people's life standards.
Yeah, Gary, if you haven't come across him, he's an incredible communicator. He's written a really fascinating book and an incredibly successful banker who's turned into an equally successful fighter against inequality. I'm not sure whether he can kickbox, but he's truly fascinating interview, wasn't it? So shall we listen?
Yes, let's listen.
So Gary, welcome to Equals. It's amazing to have you on. We love your work and the fight you're making against inequality. And here we are, Davos week, with once again seeing how rich the world's billionaires are. But could you perhaps go back a bit and start by telling our listeners a bit more about your life and background and crucially, the journey that took you to be such a fierce critic of inequality today?
Yeah, okay. So my name's Gary Stevenson. I grew up in East London, quite a poor family. I was always good at maths as a kid. So like most kids who are good at maths in London, I wanted to be a banker, not really knowing what a banker was. I worked hard. I got into London School of Economics, very fancy university. I studied maths and economics there. And when I was there, I won a competition, which is a card game that used to be run by Citibank before the 2008 financial crisis. And because of that, I got a job as a trader when I was just 21, very young. I didn't even know what I was doing. And I happened to start that job in 2008. And then my job when I was working for Citibank, I was a short-term interest rates trader, which basically means betting on central bank base rates. So you might remember, you might not remember, in 2008, similarly to during COVID, all of the interest rates in the rich world, at least, fell very quickly to zero. And that was like a big shocking thing for economists at the time. Obviously now we've seen long periods of zero interest rates, but back then in 2008, that was like a big zero interest rates. Nobody's ever done it except for Japan, who done it a bit. And because of that, everybody, all the traders, all the economists, expected and predicted a very big, sharp economic recovery, a quick economic recovery. That's also very similar to COVID, actually. The whole situation was quite similar to COVID. And then, obviously, what we know now, is that economic recovery was very slow to arrive. My job at the time was to bet on what interest rates were going to be. So this was like super interesting for me, right? So you come out of university and you kind of think you know a little bit about economics. And then you see 2008, massive crisis, nobody predicted it. And then what I think more interesting than the crisis itself was every single year from 2008 all the way up to 2020, economists and financial markets and traders predicted there would be a recovery in interest rates, which is basically predicting there would be an economic recovery. That didn't happen. So why was it that we had these 13 years where all of the smart people predicted a recovery that didn't happen? And I think that's really interesting. But I was sitting there in my early 20s as a very junior trader, and what I saw was 2008, everybody's wrong. 2009, everybody is wrong again. 2010, everybody's wrong again. And by the beginning of 2011, I kind of started to realize that basically our economists are kind of rubbish. Like all they do is just get everything wrong every year. And I think that's still true today, basically. But, I was young, I wanted to make money. What I saw was, if everybody here is making wrong predictions every single year, if I can figure out what's happening, I can make a ton of money. And sort of, why not me, in a way? Because if these guys around me are the best paid economists in the world and they're wrong all the time, I've got the training they've got, why can't I figure it out, basically? So I became obsessed, and I still am obsessed, really, in trying to understand why the economy was so weak after 2008 and the same today, while it's weak today. And what I wanted to sort of, if you look at the economic theory here, what the economic theory said at the time, still says today, is quite simple. Low interest rates are supposed to stimulate the economy because they're supposed to get businesses and people out there spending money, because there's no point saving because rates are low. It's easy to borrow if you want to borrow because rates are low. So businesses should be investing and people should be spending money. And that wasn't happening in really the whole, 15 years, the whole period from 2008 to 2020. And I had this crazy idea, which, if you've not done it, you should do it. I think a lot more economists should do it, of basically going out and asking people, why aren't you spending more money? They all said, well, what do you mean? We're spending everything we've got. We're not spending more money because we don't have any more money. And from an economic perspective, this is quite interesting, right? Because again, 2008, similarly to 2020, you've got all this money being poured into the economy by governments and central banks. Massive government deficits, quantitative easing, zero interest rates. All of these things are supposed to pour money into the economy, make people richer and get people spending money. And yet when you ask people, they're saying, well, we're not getting richer, we're getting poorer. Kind of didn't make any sense. So I didn't take people's word for it. I started to sort of look into the financial situations of my friends and their family. And what I saw back then, 2011, when I was in my early 20s, I saw, I'm from quite an ordinary, poor background. And what I saw from people from similar backgrounds was our parents' generation, ordinary people, not rich, homeowners. Our generation never would be able to own property. And what you see there is basically the loss of wealth holding of the middle class. And when you understand that that's what's happening, it doesn't make any sense to ask people, why don't you spend more money? Because what you see there is people are dissaving their wealth. Ordinary people are dissaving their wealth over the long term. That means they're on a long-term trajectory to zero wealth. And then I got called into a meeting by one of Citibank's top economists at the time. And he went through the financial situation, the fiscal situation of a lot of the countries, a lot of the world's major governments. He went through the fiscal situation of course, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Ireland, but also the UK, the US, Japan. And what you see, basically, what you saw in 2011, wherever you looked, was countries spending more than their income, running big deficits, dissaving their wealth, and building up debts. What really struck me about that situation and that meeting was not the sort of, this is bad, this is, Western welfare states will have to be shut down. I wasn't really in that sort of method of thinking at that time in my life. What really struck me was how similar the fiscal situation of major Western governments was to my friends and their families spending more than their income, running down their assets, dissaving their assets, and accumulating debts. And what was interesting to me as a mathematician, as an economist, is that that's kind of impossible, right? It should be impossible. It shouldn't be possible for both the private sector, individuals, and the public sector, governments, to simultaneously run deficits, dissave their wealth, borrow money, lose their assets, and go into debt. Like this is not theoretically possible. If somebody is accumulating debt, somebody must be accumulating credit. If somebody is losing their assets, assuming that there's not some sort of natural disaster, somebody must be accumulating those assets. But of course, I didn't have to look far. At the time, I was working on the trading floor at Canary Wharf, surrounded by millionaires, and I was getting paid at that time about £500,000 a year in my early 20s. And I realised that this is what is happening. That is the balance. Like, what you have here is a long-term systemic transfer of wealth away from Western middle classes, away from rich world governments, and towards a small super rich elite. And that is what is stopping basically governments and ordinary families from being able to increase their spending and their quality of life. So I recognised straight away this wouldn't be caught. It would worsen over time. The economic crisis would get worse and worse and worse. And I put a massive bet on in 2011 that interest rates would stay low for a very long time because the economy would stay weak for a very long time. And by the end of that year, 2011, when I turned 25, I was Citibank's most profitable trader in the world. So, that's why I'm so passionate about inequality, because I've spent, at this point, 20 years of my life studying economics, and the last 15 as a multimillionaire, because I understand and I bet on the fact that living standards are being crushed and will continue to be crushed because of growing inequality of wealth.
But one of the questions I had, Gary, is surely, you could have had all of those revelations but not cared. Do you know what I mean? And do you think there's an element of the fact that most economists are not from working class backgrounds? They're generally quite well off. Is there a link between inequality itself and the failure of economics to study it, if you see what I mean? And that most of the people going to LSE, most of the people on that trading floor are not from Ilford, are they? So in that sense, the fact that you were already quite empirical about it, that you wanted to go out, that you even had people to talk to about the impacts, do you think that itself is a kind of product of the inequality in our education system and in the economics profession?
I think people should be aware that elite level economics is extremely disproportional in terms of who's getting in there. I'm from East London and I worked in East London on a trading floor. And somebody asked me once, that's an interesting accent, where are you from? I write in my book about this amazing trader, and the book is called Billy. He didn't go to university. He was, every single year I was there, he was the top trader at the bank, except for the 1 year that I was. But the truth is, you can't do that nowadays. There's no way you can get yourself onto the trading floor if you don't have an elite university degree. And then when you look at those elite university degrees, very, very, very few people from ordinary backgrounds are getting through nowadays. And I think that is one of the reasons why economists are not talking about inequality. But if I'm being totally honest, I think the bigger reason is the way that economics is taught at university nowadays. It is, the truth of the matter is, I don't know if you studied economics, we don't talk about the housing crisis, we don't talk about the cost of living crisis. If you do economics at a high level nowadays, especially if you do it to postgrad, what you're talking about, and I'm not joking here, is 5 years, 10 years of algebra. Imagine you've spent 10 years memorizing algebra and now you're like a top PhD economist. And some kid like me says the problem is inequality. And you've spent 10 years memorizing economic models that have no wealth distribution in them. Somebody might as well turn around to you and, tell you God did it. You know what I mean? Like they have been... Really, they've kind of been brainwashed to think about the world in a way that is only mathematical, but that maths is complicated but incredibly limited. They've spent 10 years studying what they call representative agent models, right? And a representative agent model is a model in which the mathematics is very complicated, but in order to simplify, you don't look at any variety of different people in the model. You look at one single representative agent. You look at the average person. So these guys have been doing incredibly complicated maths of models which have in them a total of one person. And how much distribution can you have in a mathematical model which includes one person? The answer is none. So the truth is, these people, they have an incredible amount of skin in the game to not believe and not say the problem is inequality.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. This really hits me really hard because I am a PhD candidate in economics, but here in Brazil, one of the first things that we're told here is that we can think about models if we don't talk about political economy first. So it really, really hits me really hard when we say that people are just going into algebra and mathematics and not talking about politics, and that redistribution has no impact. So just one follow-up question on this. How do you think that curriculums could be changed in these elite spaces, or that people that come from places that talk about political economies could reach places where this perspective could be considered?
Yeah, so it's really interesting for me. Like I studied at London School of Economics back in 2005 to 2008. And back then, all of the best students wanted to be traders. And you can see why. There's a massive, massive financial incentive for them to be traders, like relative to staying on to do like further economics. And then you do your undergrad. And we're all just trying to get jobs as traders. You learn your theory. You go get a job as a trader. And academic economics was kind of a joke on the trading floor. Like everybody knows that it's just some stupid stuff you do to get a job. Everybody knows that. And that was difficult for me when I first started, because you've studied this thing and you want to kind of respect this thing. You want to understand it. But over time, I came to almost love, in a way, the way that trading works, which is trading forces people to make predictions and it rewards people who make correct predictions. And the reason I love that is because that is a very objective way to measure how good somebody is. And that method of measuring really protects people like me who come from poor backgrounds and don't have any sort of cultural capital to compete with. And what's really frustrating for me is, I was a very well known, very well respected, very well paid trader at an incredibly young age, because I had a long track record of good predictions. Now, I've been doing like public facing work, kind of media work in economics since 2020, really. And the first thing I did was I wrote an article for a website called Open Democracy, and I wrote a similar article for The Guardian, and I made a video on YouTube in early 2020, all saying the same thing, that we will see, because of COVID, a massive inflation crisis, a cost of living crisis, a collapse in living standards, a huge increase in inequality, a huge increase in asset prices, gold prices, house prices. We'd see all of these and these predictions were incredibly good. These are incredibly good predictions made by somebody with the professional track record of incredibly good predictions. Now, if you do that in the city, if you make amazingly good predictions, you get recognized for it. Making correct predictions does not get you anywhere in public-facing economics. Now, economics is not a discipline where macroeconomics, we can't do experiments. So for me, what you need to do, in my opinion, is you need to allow people to compete with the established public-facing economists on making correct predictions. Because until you do that, there will be no way for good economists from working class backgrounds like me to force the people who actually influence governments to listen. So I've been saying for 5-6 years now that living standards are going to collapse, living standards are going to keep worsening, and I've been betting on it. And in that time, I've made millions of pounds betting on it. I've been talking about it on YouTube incredibly publicly. I've been writing about it in the newspapers. I've got millions of followers here in the UK. Governments have done nothing about inequality, seen inequality massively increase, seen living standards collapse, and the whole time they're predicting things are going to get better when they're not.
You're talking a lot about the extreme of wealth inequality. Why are we seeing huge extremes of wealth inequality? And what are the economic forces driving it? And how does it impact on everyday people trying to make a start in life?
Personally, I think that if you do not regulate inequality, if you do not have very progressive tax systems, in particular that focus on the very rich, it is simply that the natural direction of capitalism, because basically of compound interest, that wealth accumulates, wealth concentrates, and you end up with the very high levels of inequality, which have been the norm across the world for a long time. But it's not that complicated, right? If I'm a billionaire, if I have $1 billion and I make 5% a year on that, which I think is quite a conservative return, I'm making $50 million a year. If you're making $50 million a year, how much are you going to spend? You're going to struggle to spend even $5 million a year, and then you're going to buy $45 million of assets. So, when you have rapidly growing economies, that might work to a degree, but when economies are not growing rapidly, which I don't think they can do sustainably forever, it is the obvious thing that will happen. The rich will use their incredibly high passive incomes to outcompete the middle class for assets, and wealth inequality will increase. So I think, really, to be honest, unless you have very high rates of tax, especially on extreme wealth, I think very high levels of wealth inequality and wealth concentration are simply the norm.
Gary, can I ask you a bit about it's immensely frustrating that policymakers are not listening to kind of these perspectives. And our report for Davos this year is called Resisting the Rule of the Rich. And we're documenting how economic inequality all over the world is translating into political inequality, i.e. like the richest people. One of our killer facts this year is that a billionaire is 4,000 times more likely to hold political office than an ordinary person. So, billionaires, we're seeing them go into government influence the media. How important do you think that is in terms of stopping sensible policies happening?
I think it's very important. But I think really the main thing it does is it enables them to do what they would do anyway, really, which is when they are very, very rich, it becomes very easy for them to buy a bigger share of the assets. I think the problem you have is that these people, these very, very rich people, they don't even really need to be evil or malign. Once you are that rich, it is very, very difficult for you to do anything else than to accumulate power. Once your wealth is that large, I mean, it's hard to imagine. If you had a passive income, a billionaire makes a passive income of $1 million a week. Elon Musk is worth, it's 700 billion, so this guy's making $700 million a week passive income. That's insane. It's $700 million a week, but $100 million a day passive income. I think what people don't realize is they think of these numbers as just abstract numbers. The money means nothing. The money means nothing. The money is used to buy real things. And of course, it's an obvious thing for them to do is to buy the media. Because, I mean, look, if you're Elon Musk right now, if you're smart, you can see what's happening, which is that living standards are falling. And you can see that people are not happy with living standards falling. And maybe if you're a bit smarter, you realize that the billionaire class is something to do with that. And you can see that the political winds are turning, right? You can see that as living standards fall, more and more people are demanding political change. And you are going to think, well, I can use my power to decide what kind of political change we're going to get, right? So I think we can see now, looking around, what is going to be the next stage in politics, what is going to be the next stage in economics, because there's two voices which are basically leading the charge for how things need to change. There's me and my lot saying what we need to do is we need to reduce inequality, we need to tax the very rich much, much more, we need to make it easier for ordinary people to own wealth, we need to protect government wealth, we need to protect welfare states. And there's another group of people saying the problem is foreigners, the problem is immigrants. So if you are Elon Musk or another billionaire, politics is going to change. One group is saying what we need to do is tax billionaires. What are you going to do? You are going to try to influence to make sure that the other group wins. And the other group, of course, is the problem is foreigners, the problem is immigrants. If you look at these anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant parties in any country in the world, they are always funded by billionaires. They are always funded by billionaires. And why do the billionaires do that? They know that society is going to move in one of two ways now, either hatred of foreigners or taxation of billionaires. For them, it's an investment. It's as simple as that.
The way you put it just makes so much sense, doesn't it, Grazie? Your biggest solution that you talk about the most, Gary, is and so do we at Oxfam, is increased taxation of wealth and the wealth of the super rich. Do you see some traction there? Do you think there was any reason for hope that we could see increased taxation of wealth and of rich people in the coming years? And what can we do to make that side win, if you like, to go back to your previous answer?
So I've been campaigning on this quite aggressively in the last, say, 2 years. I published a book which came out 2 years ago, and it's been very successful here. And I've got a YouTube and social media and all these channels, Instagram, everything, called Gary's Economics. The channel has become incredibly popular around the world, and it's definitely raised awareness of the need to tax the very rich. And it's reached the point where there's an overwhelming polling majority for increased taxation of the very rich, for wealth taxes. So the people want it. What we've got is phenomenal traction with the public. I think it's quite interesting where we are now because the public overwhelmingly want it. And yet there's a kind of, Piketty calls them, Thomas Piketty, the French inequality economist, calls them the Brahmin class, which is this kind of class of intellectuals and politicians and academics and people in media. Really, these are the people that are stopping it.
You have projected that we are going to keep seeing this extreme wealth inequality rising, and that at the same time, the living standards for most people in the world are going to be reduced. So I was wondering, for sure we need to tax the super rich. And beyond that, what else could be done? Which measures, with which regulatory policies could be adopted?
Yeah, I think if you don't tax the super rich, you're going to be very, very limited in what you can achieve. We're going to end up with just these sort of pushing these free market policies, this growth agenda. That's sort of your alternative, is just grow, grow, grow. But any growth which you achieve, it's going to be hard to have that growth when you have a very weak consumer, when you have a very weak government, because you're going to have very little end demand. Any growth that you get from free market policies is going to be basically producing things to sell to very rich people, because those are the only guys who have a lot of extra consumption power. Really, I think you do need to focus on taxation. It doesn't necessarily need to be just the wealth tax, which is what I look at here. There's been the other guys who really work on this are the French economists Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zucman. Gabriel Zucman is having a lot of traction for wealth taxes in France, but they've also done work on minimum corporation tax rate. The obvious thing to do is to look at tax evasion and avoidance. Corporation tax is the obvious one, but so many taxes are avoided at the top end. I think one thing which we really need to do, and it's crazy that we haven't done, is start collecting data on wealth distribution. The truth is we have so little data on wealth distribution, and people criticize me and say, well, you say inequality is increasing, but the data doesn't show that. And then when you push them on the data, what they'll say is, well, actually, we don't have any data, because at the moment we have great data on income because we tax income. The reason that we have no data on wealth is because we don't tax wealth. So at the moment, we don't even know what's happening in the wealth distribution. I wish we had better data, because if we had better data, we could very clearly show that wealth inequality is increasing. So, obviously I would say this because this is what I campaign for. Any form of taxation policy that targets the super rich. But other things that we can do is we can try to improve economics, to get economists to be talking about this more. I think I've had a lot of traction here on social media, and we're really winning the public, but a lot of that pushback is from economics and from economists themselves. So I think a lot of work could be done within economics, definitely trying to get them to be more open-minded and less just incredibly small-minded in the way you think about the economy.
I agree. It does feel to me like, I just remember how much enthusiasm there was after the financial crisis about heterodox economics and how it's going to be taught differently, and the work of Ha-Joon Chang, who I know you're a big fan of, and it felt like there might be a shift, and yet here we are like 15 years later, and it's still being taught in the same way. It feels so intractable.
Yeah, one of the big problems that you have is the vast majority of economics undergrads are doing that because they want to get jobs in finance. And I think, you've got to face facts here, right? We live in a difficult economic situation, right? If I wanted to be a public-facing economist, a PhD economist, whatever, advising the government, I would have had to do a master's, a PhD, probably a postdoc, and then you're like trying to get a teaching position and you're working your way up. And if I was lucky, I'd start making some decent money in my mid-30s, late 30s maybe, by which time I'd have been hundreds of thousands of pounds in debt. Instead, I went to the city and I was a multimillionaire at 25. I come from a very poor background, right? That money brought me the flat that I'm talking to you from. When my brother needed help buying a flat, I helped him. When my sister needs help, I'm helping her. That money is financial security for my entire family. In that context, what kind of person is going to pursue economics at a higher level? Obviously, you have some people who are incredibly motivated by something, like it sounds like you are, Graziella, but a lot of people, the reason that they're going to choose to study economics at a higher level is because they're rich enough to afford to. But people from poorer backgrounds who are very good at economics, can they really afford to take economics PhDs? I think in a lot of cases, they can't.
Gary, coming back to this issue of communicating, getting the message out there, it does feel like the other side is so much better talking to the public, convincing them that the reason they can't pay their bills or they can't afford a house is because of migrants or some other minority. What do you think we could do better to educate the public, to convince people that their problem is not migrants in boats, it's billionaires in yachts?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So, I started having these ideas about inequality when I was working as a trader. I decided I want to do something. I was worried about what was going to happen to living standards, to the economy of ordinary people in the long term. And I started to try to figure out, okay, where do I change things? And I looked, as my first port of call, to the political left because, as a sort of naive, non-political person, I assumed if what you want to do is tax the rich and reduce inequality, you'll get your support from the political left. And I sort of, fished around the political left for a while. And I was surprised to see how niche taxing the rich and reducing inequality was in the political left. But also, I've got to be honest, as somebody coming from a working class background, coming from a background in finance as well, I often felt incredibly unwelcome and unwanted on the political left. And sometimes I still do. Sometimes has a problem with just effectiveness. So, I was floating around the political left for ages, trying to tell people, we need to do something focused on inequality, focused on taxing the rich, focus on wealth taxes, focus on social media, making video. But I mean, of course you've got to be on social media. Of course you've got to be making videos. The far right, the alt-right, whatever you want to call them, look at how much success they've had on social media. I've got to be honest, I think that is related to the problem with class. Because at the end of the day, it's not their friends, it's not their family, it's not their communities who can't afford to feed their kids, but it's people I know who can't afford to feed their kids. And I think that is perhaps why I focus more on actually being effective and winning than often I see other people on the left do.
Thanks, Gary. Listen, that was brilliant.
Wow, what an amazing interview. I really learned a lot from him, and something that caught my attention a lot as a PhD student was on the need to change the way that economics is taught and really make inequality a really relevant part of the curriculum.
I agree. We should keep fighting for economics to properly recognise inequality. I mean, the other thing that struck me and has always impressed me about Gary is what an incredible communicator he is, how he makes these quite complex things so simple to understand, and he connects, things like high finance with people's everyday realities of not being able to afford to pay the bills or to buy a house, and the points he made about the need to get better and better at communicating, that all of us who want to fight against inequality need to be brilliant at using video, at using social media, in the same way that the right is, to really, really communicate broadly in simple terms how important it is to fight inequality. So he's clearly very good at that, and I think what he said about that was bang on, to be honest. I completely agree.
Yeah, me too.
Anyway, so great interview, and the exciting thing is you've got 2 Equals episodes this week, so there's another one coming out in the next couple of days, and its theme this year of Davos, as I said, is political inequality and the power over politics at the top, but also the protests at the bottom and the wave of Gen Z protests across the world. And the podcast is with interview with 3 Gen Z protesters on the front lines in France, in Nepal, and in Kenya. That's a fantastic episode, which is coming out later in the week. So do tune in. Bookmark Equals, tell your friends. In fact, make a New Year's resolution to listen to Equals, and we hope to talk to you next time.
That's a great New Year resolution. Talk to you next time.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.